Hospitals and schools are bombed from the rebel-held side of Syria's Aleppo, where al-Nusra terrorists have taken up positions. Meanwhile, as France and the US accuse Russia of war crimes in Syria, we take a closer look at how Washington deals with the collateral damage it's inflicted throughout the world. Also, leaked documents suggest Hillary Clinton gets too cozy with the media in the latest scandal to hit her US presidential campaign. And coming up,
the primary responsibility for unaccompanied children in France, including those in the Calais camp, lies with the French authorities.
I ask Great Britain to assume its moral duty.
France and the UK clash over who will accept hundreds of lone refugee children from the notorious jungle camp in Calais as time runs out before its closure. Live from our international news centre here in Moscow, this is RT. Good to have your company. My name's Ewan O'Neill. Civilians in the government-held part of Aleppo have come under terrorist mortar fire during yet another deadly night. We have obtained recent video from the embattled city. Sounds of gunfire can be clearly heard. Well, that is just the latest incident, but the barrage of shelling and gunfire is a daily occurrence. People in the city live in constant fear, as al-Nusra terrorists are simply just streets away. Well, let's take a look at the proximity between civilians and terrorists in the city. Now, here is western Aleppo on this side, the government-controlled area. Now, the shelling comes, however, from the eastern part, where various rebel groups are intermingled with al-Nusra fighters. However, the Western media seems to be focusing on the suffering of children purely in the eastern part of the city.
Bombing yesterday killed at least 15. In the aftermath, this heart-wrenching moment, two brothers learning their other brother is among the dead.
Fall on rebel-held eastern Aleppo. Boud al-Zayat, 7, has shrapnel lodged near his spine.
It's 4,500 children in Aleppo alone. Millions more displaced without a home. Now that includes Omran. And what strikes me is we shed tears, but there are no tears here. He doesn't cry once.
However, what is happening in the government-controlled areas goes largely unreported. Murat Gaziev went to western Aleppo to see how people there are managing to cope.
4 rebel rockets fired from eastern Aleppo into western Aleppo literally tore off the facade, the face of this school. It's situated only a kilometer from the front lines. Nevertheless, they had no choice. They had to keep it going. And by the way, classes are in session.
Our school is constantly coming under fire from terrorists. Just yesterday, a shell landed in the schoolyard. Thank goodness the children were already in the classrooms and no one got hurt.
Just hours after we left, 12 more rebel shells hit this very neighborhood. Three civilians killed, medics told us, more than a dozen injured. Not everyone gets painkillers, they're in short supply. But this is just what we filmed in the emergency room. This hospital is a veritable compendium of tragic stories. 3 days ago, this young boy, born deaf and mute, lost a leg to rebel shelling. He tried to explain to us what happened.
His name is Hassan. He's just 10 years old. The day before yesterday, he was playing with other boys in the Al-Hamdaniya area when a shell landed there. One of the boys was torn apart completely, and my nephew had his foot blown off.
He's just one of the thousands of children and adults that pass through here. More will come tomorrow, and the next day, and the next.
The day before yesterday, I was on my way to a bakery to get some bread for my parents when all of a sudden a gas cylinder landed and exploded nearby. The shrapnel hit me in the back and damaged my spine.
Their stories won't get much more coverage than a vague article in Western media, if that. You see, these people live in the bad part of Aleppo, the government side. And what happens in Western Aleppo is made to stay there. Editorial policy makes sure of that. Morad Gazdiev, RT in Aleppo.
Well, as Murat was filing us that report, Western officials were accusing Moscow of war crimes over its anti-terror strikes.
Russia and the regime owe the world more than an explanation about why they keep hitting hospitals and medical facilities and children and women. These are acts that beg for an appropriate investigation of war crimes.
This population is the victim of war crimes. Those who commit these acts will pay for this responsibility before the International Court of Justice.
Well, with the U.S. firing accusations at Moscow, RT's Gaine Chichikan took a closer look at how Washington deals with the collateral damage inflicted by its own military.
As the U.S. calls for an investigation into alleged Russian war crimes, the history of the U.S.'s own military interventions shows that Washington has always shielded itself from potential war crimes prosecution. The list of the U.S.'s actions, which the international community never got to investigate, is long. In the Iraq War, U.S. forces fired depleted uranium weapons at civilian areas, for which studies show Iraqis are still paying the price, as they see an increase in cancer and birth defects in affected areas.
The Americans are gone, but we're still suffering from the consequences.
Despite international outcry, no one was held accountable for the consequences. As part of its war on terrorism, the U.S. government had tortured people for years in violation of the UN Convention Against Torture.
We tortured some folks.
And yet no one could bring a case against the perpetrators. In 1999, with the goal of protecting Kosovo Albanians, NATO, led by the U.S., had bombed Yugoslavia for almost 4 months, killing hundreds of civilians, with targets including Serbia's radio and television headquarters. The U.S. had dismissed calls to investigate NATO's actions there, deeming them justified.
There is always a cost to defeat an evil. It never comes for free, unfortunately. But the cost of failure to defeat a great evil is far higher.
In Libya, it was to defeat Gaddafi that NATO, again led by the U.S., violated its UN mandate, which was to protect civilians, and helped kill the late Libyan leader.
We came, we saw, he died.
What followed was Libya plunging into chaos.
The United States not even placing themselves under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. It's saying that we're above the law and other countries should be held to account, but not us, because we're the biggest and the most powerful military, so whatever we do is correct. And so it doesn't hold itself to account. It brushes off the war crimes that it commits by saying it's collateral damage.
Then there are the tragic incidents that the U.S. acknowledges as mistakes, like the bombing of a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, which killed 42 people last year, despite Doctors Without Borders having previously notified U.S. forces of the hospital's location.
Accidentally killed Warren and Giovanni this past January.
A hospital was mistakenly struck.
When making mistakes, the U.S. dismisses calls for an independent investigation and says the Pentagon will investigate its own actions. Like in the case of the Kunduz hospital bombing, the Pentagon usually comes to the conclusion that its killing of civilians was unintentional and therefore not a crime. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chagyan, RT.
Well, let's look further into this now with Sergei Trifkovich, Foreign Affairs Editor for Chronicles magazine. You're very welcome to the program. Is the U.S. in any position to actually point the finger over war crimes? Because we know that their own airstrikes have resulted in a deadly price for civilians in Syria. I've got some figures in front of me. In September, 62 Syrian soldiers were killed, some 40 people killed in 2 raids back in July in Manbij.
Well, of course it's not in terms of a rational and moral world. On the other hand, intoxicated by their own brew of American indispensability and American exceptionalism, the leaders of the United States do not have a sane understanding of these issues and judge them on ad hoc basis. Our friends and we ourselves never commit war crimes. The other side does all the time.
Where do you think the line then is drawn between collateral damage and war crimes? In essence, who decides that?
Well, the point is that there is a very important term, deliberate targeting. And if you are out to get a hospital or another civilian target, like a passenger train during the NATO bombing campaign in Serbia in 1999, or if you drop cluster bombs on a crowded market like they did in the city of Niš during that same campaign, it is evidently a war crime. On the other hand, collateral damage, quote unquote, is most of the time decided upon by the person speaking. So we do not have an objective yardstick, and we do not have an objective body to judge it, because the experience with international jurisprudence over the past 2 decades is abysmal. The Hague Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has turned into a weapon of NATO and the United States, effectively.
Can I just throw another aspect into the mix here? A German magazine has exposed that while presenting evidence of Russian airstrikes in Aleppo, the French delegation to the UN used a photo taken in Gaza back in 2014. Do you think that could have been a genuine mistake or a deliberate effort to actually mislead?
Well, I think it's a deliberate effort by someone lower down the scale, and then at the top they swallow it line, hook and sinker. But it happens all the time. During the Bosnian War in 92-95, we've seen any number of pictures with the same message. For instance, a woman in black kissing a cross at the grave, and the caption was a mother, mourning her Muslim son in Sarajevo. It's absurd. But it is what I would call atrocity management. And it is always an introduction to a more sinister scenario which entails intervention in the name of the nebulous doctrine of responsibility to protect. Now, that doctrine is, of course, only applied in accordance with preconceived geopolitical and military objectives.
We're talking to Sergei Trifkovich, Foreign Affairs Editor of Chronicles magazine. Sergei, if you'll just stay with us for a few moments, we're going to talk about another aspect, that of Yemen. We'll come back to you with a question in just a moment. Indeed, Saudi Arabia has also avoided an investigation into alleged war crimes. That is despite its deadly 18-month-long campaign in Yemen, which is backed by Washington. Human rights organizations have raised concerns of a humanitarian catastrophe, but it appears as if it's falling on deaf ears. On Saturday, over 150 people were killed in an airstrike on a funeral.